who are unable to attend the live session, or if you want to go back and rewatch the discussion or share it, it'll be on the YouTube channel, and we usually share the link at the end. I would like to acknowledge that I am joining you today from Edmonton, Alberta on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional meeting ground, gathering place, and traveling route for the Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene, and Stoney Nakoda. I would like to acknowledge all of the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit whose footsteps have marked these lands for centuries. I believe a treaty is an inheritance, a responsibility, and a relationship, and I hope that recognizing our status as treaty people is one small action of many that will help us to be good neighbors to one another, good stewards of the land, and good ancestors to all our children. I do welcome you to share in the chat more about the lands you might be joining us from and acknowledging those treaties as well. Welcome to the few who have trickled in. We're just getting started. AMAASE is our monthly opportunity for members of the ecosystem to access and ask questions of a panel of capacity builders. It is held on the second Wednesday of every month from 3:30 to 5 Mountain Standard Time. I would like to thank everyone for attending today. I know there are always other places that we can be and other tasks that we need to complete. So we do thank both our attendees and our panelists for making this event today a priority, and I welcome you to be present and make the most of your time with us. These sessions are designed with our audience and attendees being the driver of the discussion. So this is your time and your questions that we are all here for. So I do invite you to start thinking about and gathering your questions and getting them ready so we can make the most of our time together. And I'll introduce our panel guests. And we did also have some questions pre-submitted, so we can always work through those as well. So today, I believe we have Dan Overall from the Trico Foundation, Brittany Kurlick from the Trico Foundation, Jerome Morgan from Innovate Calgary, and I didn't, did Brian make it into the room from Momentum? Do we have anyone from Momentum?
Brian was having a challenge, so I sent him a more up-to-date link, so hopefully he'll be in shortly.
Okay, so I will introduce him when he arrives. All right, we'll give Brian a minute to get settled, and now invite you, the audience, to start gathering your questions. So the format is very open. You're welcome to unmute, raise your virtual hand under the reactions button at the bottom of your screen for most folks. You can try waving at me, but it's a big screen, so I might not see you. Or you're welcome to type your question in the chat. If you do type it in the chat, I may still invite you to turn on your video if you are comfortable to engage in conversation with the panelists. All right, to get us started, Monique, you said you're inside the school library, might not be able to speak, but maybe we can start with your question. I think this is yours. So Monique from Sync Self said, how to use the proper words and selling techniques to increase the interest and awareness of potential customers for their participation, relating to increased mental health awareness and providing prevention support. And Monique, if you want, you're welcome to type in the chat if you have any clarifications or comments on anything the panelists might have to say. Anyone want to get us started?
I have a suggestion that I've been using quite a bit lately, and it's ChatGTP to help reword in plain language, friendly language, whatever type of language that I want, actually.
Thanks, Denise. And Monique, no worries. Most people are new here when they come. What we'll do is the panelists will each have a chance to respond to your question. And if you have any questions or clarifying comments you want to make, you're welcome to pop them in the chat. And thank you, Denise, for that contribution. Did any of our panelists have any thoughts?
I would just, one of the things that a lot of organizations, like you'll see around the social entrepreneurship space, is there's certain models that are more well-known. And I think people really rely on those because they're easy to communicate to customers and people get them, right? So you see a lot of buy one, give one. If you buy this pair of shoes, we donate a pair of shoes. You see a lot of, 15% of profit on this product goes to this cause or this other organization, or you'll see even ones around like for the bottle of shampoo you buy, we plant a tree, things like that. So you do see sort of those I guess, more familiar social enterprise models. And I think it's one of the things is that for consumers, it can be really easy to visualize, hey, I'm buying a pair of shoes, you're donating a pair of shoes. And so we do see a lot of social enterprises sort of choosing that approach as a way to communicate the impact. Now, I would say, as we see more and more organizations getting into the social enterprise space, I think consumers are becoming more discerning about what does that actually mean. So for example, I use the shampoo and the tree example, and it's because I bought some shampoo and it said, hey, we're going to plant trees. And then when I read the fine print on the back of the shampoo, it said, if you email us, we'll plant a tree, right? So there's always sort of those things to be aware of. And I think consumers are becoming more conscious of that. One of the things we work with Trico at is really understanding what customer need you're filling, right? And in some cases, it can be people are buying your product. It's very similar to what else is on the market. And what's pushing you over the edge is maybe the social piece. And that's kind of how the organization is placing themselves. However, if you do look at consumer behavior, generally consumers are looking for price and quality, right? They're looking for products that are a similar price and a similar quality. And the fact that you have sort of a green lens has become more and more important over the last 20 years. And social is becoming that way. But I would say, like I said, it's becoming more popular, but then we do see some challenges with consumers sort of questioning social washing and what's happening. So we work with organizations to really understand what is the customer need you're filling, and being aware that if it is a buying social sort of aspect where maybe your social impact is disconnected from the product that you're selling, is that there might be some pressure points within the model, right? And I always use the example of if you're selling a cup of coffee and it's got this amazing social impact that you're communicating to people, if it's a crappy cup of coffee, it's a crappy cup of coffee, and nobody's going to come back a second time. And so for us, I think it's that piece of positioning yourself in both the entrepreneurial side, the social side. The more they're connected together, the less pressure points and sort of the easier it is to communicate that impact. So don't feel like you need to default to traditional models. Maybe there are other really cool models out there, and then thinking through, why is my customer here, and what's the language that's going to really resonate with that customer. So that's what I work with organizations with. We use a tool called the Blender Canvas to really understand sort of the customer need that you're filling at Trico. I'm gonna leave it there.
Thanks, Brittany. And I do think Brian from Momentum is in the room, so I'll get you to give a wave, Brian. And welcome to our panelists. We're just getting started on our first question. Dan or Jerome, did you have anything to add to that question?
Hey, yeah, I'll go ahead. Yeah, no, I was thinking, you know, success has clues, right? So I think of the companies that you're also following and the language that you're using, that you're engaged with, that fit with your values. And so I think it's also to kind of pay attention to the companies that you're really connected to, that's fostering the impact that you're trying to align with, and really leaning into that as what's resonating with you. Then I think about also just getting closer to the end user and your customer and your client to see what they're also responding to. And I think as long as your message is authentic to the values that you're trying to portray and your brand, I think you're moving in the right direction, as well as when you're really leaning in towards that customer journey experience, versus just trying to get something of whatever, you know, works as tricky marketing or catchy marketing. I don't necessarily think that's the way to go. I think you want to stay authentic to the type of impact you're fostering and the type of customer and community that you're trying to build with your customers, and staying more aligned towards that. But definitely success has clues. So really look at the brands that and your competitors and the folks that you are attuned to, and to see what they're doing differently, and align with that and make sure it's authentic to your brand and your company.
That's true.
Just to really build on what actually both Jerome and Brittany said, to me, there's really very high level 3 basic techniques for figuring out how to use the proper words and selling techniques. Number 1, and Jerome talked about this, is find businesses that are similar to you and talking to similar customers and see how they do it and how they're successful. Number 2 is having conversations with the customers you're trying to serve and better understand their needs. And 3, because sometimes customers don't really know what they want. Sometimes Steve Jobs talked about that all the time. You have to master the art of experiments, quickly, frugally, figuring out, testing things, whether they work with customers or not. And if you focus on those 3 things, sooner rather than later, you'll be able to get the right kind of pitch of conversation that will resonate with your customers.
Could I just add a quick anecdote to Dan's number 2? Is that okay?
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
I kind of build on what Jerome was saying too. So at Momentum right now, we're trialing this model where someone takes a tech training program, and instead of paying up front, they pay once they get a job, once they get a full-time job, and then they start paying based on a percentage of their income that they're earning. So it's a relatively new model. And for me, I was like, oh, the tagline we have to use here is like, learn now, pay later. That's what we should be using. And I was convinced until we had a focus group and we asked a bunch of people that took a similar program that we would be recruiting from for the program. And they, in reasonably strong sense, said, that sounds like it might be a scam. If you lead with that language, like, we might not actually think that's a legit program. And I was surprised to hear that, because I just felt so confident in the learn now, pay later tagline that we were thinking of. So just an example of how that validation with the potential audience can actually direct the language that you use down a whole different pathway.
And if I may just build on the comment that built on the previous comments, which included mine. This goes way back. I don't know if you will recall, but at one time, Coke was losing ground to Pepsi. So they actually did a focus group to do taste tests. And as it turned out, people preferred the taste of Pepsi. So they created new Coke, where they went away from their traditional flavor and tried to aspire to be something very similar to Pepsi. And people absolutely hated it. And they had to, this cost them like millions, if not billions of dollars. And the problem with the focus group is they just did blind taste tests. They didn't factor in that Coke users who then had this new weird tasting Coke would reject it. So in the focus group, they didn't factor in the kind of emotional connection that people had to Coke already. So yes, focus groups are crucial, but they're surprisingly tricky. And that's why, particularly with Trico's techniques, we always look at staying within what we call affordable loss, where you're trying to like sniff out these things and experiment with them in a way that doesn't kind of break the bank or the venture you're trying to do. So unfortunately, this can all be very, very tricky.
There we go. Sorry, guys, it's been a while. Thank you, Dan. And I think Monique is able to unmute and clarify a little bit about what she's referring to. So I'll invite you to do that now.
Hi, everyone. My name is Monique. Sorry, I'm at the library, so I tried not to speak too loud. And sorry for my English, because I'm just an international student here, so I'm trying to, just practice better English. My service idea is about like create a platform to have one-on-one like conversation, deep conversation with people. Actually, it's about like to uncover their like unseen or hidden abilities or potential. So it's also related to their personal experiences and stories, and also related to their personal values and beliefs. So I think the platform is try to like for them to understand themselves more, or as well as their like personal wellness and everything. So that's why I try to create a platform, the conversation, like one section for it, like each lasts for 1.5 hours, so I can, like guide them to explore their experiences deeply and widely. So it's not a weekly section, it's only one section. So even though they are not in the very struggle or depressed status, so this is a platform for them to like for self-exploration and self-understanding. Because this is not like when they are very depressed or the situation, they look for like some professionals or like see therapists or something like that. So I feel like it's difficult to persuade people to try the platform because this is not their like first priority while they are like working hard or study hard, and then they don't want to spend the time for the process. But for me, as I like practice in Hong Kong, I'm from Hong Kong, and I see the benefit for people as well as for myself, because during the conversation they truly understand themselves more, and they can have the like aha moment for for moving them to the next step. But every time I try to persuade or explain the service idea, it takes a long time. It's like now I need to take like several minutes to explain, and then people will just you know they lost their interest, and then they don't set it for their first priority. So that is my difficulty to start the service, the platform for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Monique. Did any of our panelists want to add maybe to their feedback to Monique?
I would just add it's really interesting to hear sort of what you're doing. At Trico, one of the things that we're working with organizations on is sort of like even how you think about things and how you interpret things and how that can impact how you deal with challenges or you uptake opportunities. And it's really difficult work to get people to go down those layers, right? And it's probably the thing that's going to move them forward the most, but it's also the thing that feels the most uncomfortable. So we see lots of organizations really struggle with that piece. So it's interesting to see that that's sort of a piece that you're playing at. And I'm not surprised that it does take a while to describe it, right? Because it's something that people really struggle with for sure. And so that's one of the things we work with organizations a lot is, how do you actually understand all of these different systems and different things that are happening that are actually interacting with how you're interpreting a situation or how you're responding to a situation.
Thanks, Brittany. I'll throw it out to our panelists one more time, and then I think Denise had a couple clarifying questions that we'll get to. Is there any other thoughts from our panelists? All right, so Denise has asked, Monique, if you're able to answer, who is your target audience? What problem are you trying to solve? And what is your story behind developing this? If you are able to provide a kind of an overview response to that.
I'm thinking to provide a service for maybe international students or newcomers, because we all speak a different language. So English is not our first language. So maybe sometimes they want to find something to explain how they feel or the thing they are struggling with is easier for us to communicate, I think. Yeah.
Any closing thoughts on that question before we shift towards the next one? All right. Thank you, Monique and Denise and our panelists for your contributions. For our next question is from Jude from Purple. And Jude asks, how typically does the panel see selling our product or service piece of a social enterprise as a barrier to success? And is Jude in the room? Oh, there, you're in front of me. That's why they spotlighted you. Did you want to provide any clarity on that, Jude?
No, just to say that we work a lot with social enterprises, particularly in the non-profit sector, quite often, rather than the for-profit sector, when non-profits are starting a social enterprise, based obviously very much on their mission. And I'm just wondering, certainly the ones that we work with, we find that that's quite often a barrier, is just that kind of shift in culture from being a non-profit to actually having a kind of sales culture and a sales mentality. And I'm just wondering if many others come across that as a barrier to long-term success, and if there's been any kind of great ways of going about solving that amongst the panel or others on the call.
So I would say one of the things that you hear a lot of in this space, and I don't think it's the full picture of what's going on, is you do hear, oh, well, nonprofits just have to start getting better at business. They just have to start figuring and think, they have to think more like business. And I think there's principles for sure, but I think a lot of not-for-profits do think like business and have a lot of business skills already in them. Like, even if you start thinking about your programs, you have customers, they're just not necessarily who's paying for, like, they're not customers, they're beneficiaries and things like that. And I think there's this piece around sometimes pulling out the skills that already exist within organizations. So even as you start like looking into a social enterprise idea, a lot of the time it's building on strengths that already exist, right? And there can be pushback in terms of, well, we're just going to start charging our beneficiaries now, right? And that's not generally the case, and not often the case. Often it's maybe there's a different client group. It's something that you're really good at that you're now going to build on and look at different customers for that. And the other thing is social entrepreneurship is one way to have social impact. There's many ways to have social impact. And so when we work with organizations around social impact, is social entrepreneurship makes sense when it's allowing you to use markets in a new way that's allowing you to have impact in a new way as well. So organizations often look at how can we have different impact on the beneficiaries that we currently serve or we currently work with, right? So maybe it's something like, so Embers is a great example out of Vancouver, where they were doing like microloans in the community, and they were realizing that, you know, there was something else happening in their community, and they developed a different stream to support a new group, right? In a deeper and a different way than they potentially could have through their traditional programming. And so one of the things that, like, when I'm working with an organization is the pushback can be tricky, right? And especially within an organization, if people don't really understand that. And often it's just kind of like, oh, we're going to start selling things. And there's this piece around really understanding, what does that look like within our organization, right? How does that impact the work that we do? How does it build upon the social impact that we're currently having? And I think those are all really big conversations. And on the flip side, there's the conversation of when you're talking to boards who may be pushing this and saying, hey, we need to get into social entrepreneurship. It's not easy, right? A colleague of ours that we used to work with used to use the example of the couple that you would see on a talk show that would say, hey, we're having a really difficult time in our relationship, so we've decided to have a baby, right? That's your social enterprise. It's probably not the time to have a baby. And so I think there's the piece around really understanding the potential in this space, but understanding that it looks different for every organization, and also really being clear on, why are we doing this? Like, what is our goal? What is driving us to do this? What are our financial goals? And what are our social goals? And then having the gut check, is this right for our organization? Is this the right time for our organization at all layers within an organization? Because it can be a mindset shift, but I also think there's so much amazing work being done in traditional charities and not-for-profits, that there's so many things that align with social entrepreneurship as well. It's just kind of like adding a new lens to it, and then having some of those difficult conversations with organizations. So we at Trico work with organizations a lot, like I said earlier, about understanding, well, what customer need are you filling? On the other side is, what impact is your social model having on the product or service you're selling? What are your goals socially? We work with organizations about it in terms of a mountain, but what are those social and financial goals that get you to where you want to be from where you are, like where you are now to where you want to be? And what are some of those scary things on the journey that you really need to figure out, or the places that you need to gut check? And so we talk to organizations a lot about talking to those who've been there, done that, right? Understanding other organizations who have gone through this process, what was successful and what like completely fell flat. The other thing we talk to organizations about, which Dan mentioned earlier, is around affordable loss, but understanding how do we test and learn in a safe way so that if we are moving in this direction, we're still protecting the assets that we have going into this. So those are sort of the types of conversations that we have with organizations that are looking at taking this different direction, right? And this different way of having both financial and social impact with their organization.
Thanks, Brittany. Brian or Jerome, just from other organizations, did either of you have anything you wanted to add to Jude's question?
Just that's a good question, because there is this culture shift that's at play for sure. In the program that we're running right now that I mentioned earlier, where we're doing this tech training, but to a slightly different demographic. In our government funded programs, we'd often say, oh, let's take a shot on this person. Let's bring them into the program because we believe in them. We want them to do well. And there's been some amazing stories of success that way. But the question changes a little bit when we need this person to repay us.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to be an important and fundamental part of our business model moving forward. Different choices have to be made, but it's the same program facilitator that's making those different choices based on the program, whether it's our enterprising program or a standard kind of government employment training program. So there is a bit of a different mindset shift that has to take place there. I feel like in these kinds of programs or initiatives, it's like, it's almost just that you have to expand what you pay attention to, because now you're holding financial impact as well as mission impact. And so your scope, people attached to those programs just to have their scope broadened to continue to look at both those things and pay attention to them. So there's just more to pay attention to. And the one last thing I'll share on that is, I think at Momentum, there's always this and every nonprofit is asking, because funding's always at risk all the time, every year. There's it's just the reality. And so social enterprise is always going to come up in the conversation. Is this our path forward? And I feel like where we kind of landed on at Momentum is that we want to be an enterprising organization. We want to have a culture that is enterprising. And whether that lands with having a separate social enterprise as a noun that's running a business, or we're enterprising even within our standard delivery of programs and how we get funding for those programs. We felt like that was an important outcome, that regardless of if it's categorized as a social enterprise or not, that we're trying to be enterprising in that work. And then hopefully that would bleed over into the actual social enterprise work that we might be doing. So it's a really good question though.
Yeah,
Thanks,
it is a really good question. I think sales is hard, right? And so it doesn't matter if it's a social enterprise or if it's, just a traditional business or a startup. We see it across the board of how do we get more customers, right? And so I think it's also just really looking into your developing the fundamentals around a sales pipeline, understanding your ideal customer, what's that key problem that you're solving, and understanding that journey to closing that deal with customers. I think some of those fundamental pieces, doesn't matter what type of, is really important to kind of just be aware of, and just have a strategy and a plan of around that. Of 100 engagements with potential customers, you're probably going to get 10% to 15% of that. So really understanding that journey and that sales pipeline around kind of cultivating your business model. So I think there's a conversation just around building the systems around sales into your social enterprise, and that being a very important component to be able to get the engagement from a certain number of folks to then be funneled into your social enterprise to then be converted into customers. But then I think also also evaluating and auditing who on our team has those skill sets to do that. Because I think that's another component of usually that technical founder or that founder that's leading may not necessarily be the best person to kind of close the deals on the customers in a certain way, but they might be able to tell the right story and do the operations of the business. But I think it's just also being able to audit of like where the strengths and weaknesses are, and then being able to make sure that you have somebody that's really good at supporting the sales and that customer engagement component. So hopefully that's helpful. But I think it's really around building the fundamentals around your sales pipeline in your business is really key.
Thanks, Jerome. And Dan, did you have anything to add?
It's a really interesting conversation. Thanks, everybody. I think part of the challenge is it seems a lot of these conversations are bleeding into each other. So, for example, for grants and government funding, there's this big push to think of either a grantor or government as customer, right? So now there's this mentality of you think of government as customer, and the disciplines that you need to actually sell a government on getting what used to be like a grant is now very, very sales based, right? So there's these kind of bleeding, or even just as I think Brian was saying, this idea of being enterprising, right? And like what actually are the elements of being enterprising that are exclusively kind of like a business mentality as opposed to like a not-for-profit mentality, which is the point that Brittany mentioned. So there's all these kind of, everybody's trying to be everybody else, so to speak. Like people who get grants want to explore sales, people who get sales want to explore grants and things like that. So it's getting to be a very confusing conversation, and trying to actually distill what the key elements are of each constituency that are unique to its constituency, I imagine is going to be increasingly difficult for these not-for-profit and charitable organizations that are trying to pick which path and then master which discipline is necessary to be good at that path. I don't know if that was particularly helpful, but I am noticing that these conversations seem to be bleeding over to each other, and I can only imagine how confusing they're getting for the demographic that we're trying to serve.
Yeah, no, I agree that's all really helpful comments. Thank you. I mean, I was really asking the question on behalf of many of the organizations we work with. We're actually a CCC ourselves in British Columbia, but we call ourselves a social enterprise. We're a coaching and consulting organization, works with a lot of nonprofits. But this seems to be a question and a barrier that comes up. And if there's one thing that we point to, if a social enterprise has not been as successful as it would have liked to have been, it's usually because they just haven't yet managed to bring the right people into the team who want to embrace the word sales. But I think often it's reframing the word itself and kind of putting it in a different context of adding value to a customer or a beneficiary or whoever that kind of end customer might be. It's adding value, it's educating, it's providing solutions, all those other things that non-profit employees or perhaps people in a employment-based social enterprise who have barriers to employment themselves but find themselves in this kind of role. I think it's reframing the word itself, especially when it comes to things like performance management and adding goals and targets and that kind of thing. I think it's really important that people see that it's not like they're selling a used car or whatever. It's very different because they're selling a mission-aligned kind of product or service or whatever it might be. So anyway, thank you so much. Really appreciate all the comments.
Thank you for your question, Jude, and to our panelists for their responses. For our next question, I'm going to call on Denise. Good to see you, Denise. We had lunch together at SBI a couple of weeks ago, so it's nice to see you again. And Denise has asked, as a for-profit social enterprise that has revenue streams to implement but not yet available, where would I look for capacity building or implementation funding? Do you want to add anything to that, Denise, before I open it to our panelists?
Yeah, maybe a little bit. Where I'm finding problems is because I'm at the implementation stage and I'm a for-profit social enterprise, the banks don't look at us in the same way. They want to see the revenue streams coming in, and nonprofit or government funding doesn't see us in the same way because we're not a nonprofit. So we're kind of stuck in the middle of this stage where we're almost there, but we're not quite there. And it seems to be the government and things are transitioning to a social enterprise aspect, but the organizations that support them haven't caught up to how to support them other than coaching, if that makes sense.
Thanks, Denise. Anyone want to take a first stab at that?
Well,
Dan, you
Trico
want to go?
always, oh, sorry. Trico has always been intrigued by helping social enterprises that have for-profit status, but as a private foundation, CRA is quite restrictive in not allowing us to do that. That's why we always find the choice organizations make to move to for-profit, especially at the early stages, always intriguing. So I don't want to put you on the spot, but could you share, what prompted you to make the decision to go the for-profit route at the given stage that you're at?
The decision was made because we work with a lot of nonprofit organizations, and what we're building, we wanted to emulate the idea of working with them and not competing for funding against them, because we are serving the nonprofit sector and supporting them in what they're doing.
Thanks, Denise, for adding to that.
Yeah, and just before other panelists jump in, that can be like really tricky, and I think you're experiencing that, because what happens is typically the benefit of for-profit model is you have a revenue generation possibility that's so exciting that it attracts investments. If you don't have that at this particular stage and you've gone with for-profit, it legally cuts you off from many of the funding opportunities that would have provided support for you at the current stage you are. So I totally get the rationale for why you're doing it. It makes complete sense, but I fear it's going to be creating, as you're experiencing, a harder journey for you to be on.
Building off of actually Brian's comment, I had thought IRP as well. I don't know if there's going to be more rounds of IRP. They've just completed one and announced the most previous, and I'm not sure if there's going to be more of those, but IRP grants were available to for-profit social enterprises and organizations with social focus, which is one of the few ones. So I talked to a lot of for-profit organizations, and I was so excited to have something to give them and to be able to send them. The other one is, and I'm not sure if you were able to connect with her, I'm guessing she was at SVI, would be Jane Bisbee for the Social Enterprise Fund, in terms of loans, right? Is that the right kind of opportunity for where you're at? If traditional banks are not responding to you in the way that you would like, that might be another avenue to look at. So I would just say, like Brian said, keep your eyes out for IRP. I don't honestly know at the moment if there's supposed to be another round or not. And then on the other side of things is maybe looking at sort of those loan opportunities that are available to social enterprises within the province of Alberta.
Yeah, to add, there's not really a lot that's out there, right? For funding, unless you're, building a product, usually tech enabled or something. There's a lot more resources obviously out there for that from Alberta. Alberta Innovates, etc., and all that. But yeah, it's really limited resources and funding, specifically around capacity building and implementation. And so it's a little bit tricky on that front. So I don't think there's too much to kind of add based off of just what Dan and Brittany identified.
Thanks. I haven't heard of IRP grants or USEED, so I'll definitely look into that. Thank you very much. We are creating or building upon what we've developed, which is a national database of gender-based violence organizations and service providers, and a help portal for individuals. Within that, we will have collected non-identifying data. So that is one product, curated information, non-identifying information for statistical purposes. That's one revenue stream possibility. The other revenue stream is a trauma-informed training course that we'll have coming up shortly. And then services to nonprofit organizations such as fractionated marketing services for smaller nonprofits where they're not having to pay for a large fee, and it's curated marketing and imagery around gender-based violence. So it's fairly universal awareness type to keep in front of their stakeholders. So we do have some revenue streams ready to launch, but I have not been able to have a set sample to give people on how it works. So it's the implementation stage. So we've developed our models, but now it's the implementation and provability stage, I guess you would call it. That's where I'm kind of at right now. Thanks,
Denise, for sharing. I will add to AMAASE.ca. As we find things that would be eligible, we're always adding more, and you can filter by incorporation status. So I know there isn't a lot out there, but things like the IRP, when they come out, they would get added there. So encourage you to stay on that as we're able to maybe hopefully find more things in that space. Any other last closing thoughts for Denise before we shift to our next question? Right.
The one thing
Jerome, go ahead.
Yeah, the one thing I'll just add is because it seems like there's some levels of research or some data collection components. So if you're able to align with the right partner, there's possibly of accessing some potential research dollars from that. I've seen some businesses, social enterprises do that with the right research person that can leverage their research funding to then support and go into the social enterprise, because it kind of it supports you, but then you also now have the data that into your system that they can leverage that's outside of just them containing it. So I think that can be also an avenue depending on exactly what you're collecting the data and how it can be used for public good in a certain way, if there's alignment with a researcher as well. So that can be an avenue around getting some access to some resources.
Thanks, Jerome. And thank you, Denise. There's a few other comments in the chat too that I encourage you to read through and see if there's anything there that might be helpful. Our next question comes from, and my apologies, Livia, I think, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. And I believe she's in the room. The question, as it was submitted, what are the best official business forms for a social enterprise in Canada? What are the best ways to bootstrap a social business? Do you want to expand on that?
Hi, no, I just want to add that, am I understanding correctly that a social business is actually a business, a strong business first, from what I just heard in the past hour or something?
That is an excellent question that I'm excited to really actually hear our panelists answer. So Brittany, I saw you unmuted. Do you want to start us off?
So the really unique piece about social entrepreneurship is you're living in two worlds, right? Is you have the social piece and you have the entrepreneurship piece, social entrepreneurship, right? So really, how are you using markets to have social good? And businesses that are in the social enterprise space have to balance those two worlds, right? And the reality is the more disconnected they are from each other, the more pressure points you're going to have in your model. There's more things that you have to think about. So we use the example of 10 Tree a lot. So 10 Tree is an apparel brand. And when 10 Tree, so 11 years ago, Dan and I started at Trico, he had been going around and talking to organizations about what were your most exciting and favorite examples of social entrepreneurship. And 10 Tree was this polarizing example because for some people, they were like really innovative and exciting. And for other people, they were not an example of social entrepreneurship. And what they did is at the time they were selling t-shirts. For every t-shirt they sold, they planted 10 trees. Really simple model. But for us at Trico, it wasn't one of our favorite examples of social entrepreneurship. And we started digging a bit down into that. And the reality is that their entrepreneurial model, the clothing that they were selling, was really separate from the trees that they were planting, their social model, right? And that can be a tricky place to be in because you've got to be good at two things. I have to be good at like making t-shirts, and I have to be good at planting trees. The other thing is you have customers who are there for different reasons, right? So some people are there because, hey, these are really cool shirts and I really like them. And the fact that I'm planting 10 trees is a nice to have. And then other people might be really excited about trees and be like, I can't believe I get a t-shirt, but really I'm here to plant trees. And at a certain point, that can be tricky with keeping your customers, right? Because some customers might start thinking like, I can get a very similar t-shirt for a little bit less, and I don't care about these trees. And on the other hand is, maybe I should take that $1.50 that's actually going to planting trees and I should donate it to a tree planting organization. And so there are just some disconnects within the model that make it a trickier model. Whereas organizations where their social and entrepreneurial are more aligned with each other, there's less pressure points, right? I focus my time and attention on kind of one piece. The work that I'm doing is building the social mission I have. And so there's things to consider. So in social entrepreneurship, it's about balancing the two. And sometimes they're going to be out of balance, but it's going to make your life a little bit trickier. That's not to say you can't do it. 10 Trees, incredibly successful. But they did an article years later that said, hey, you know what? Maybe starting an apparel business wasn't the best way to like save the planet, right? Maybe it wasn't the most logical route of going about this. But what they did is that model was what was available to them at the time, right? That's what made sense to them at the time. And now 10 years later, they've started working with only recycled materials because it's something their customers cared about, right? They started a buyback system. So rather than their items ending up in the landfill, if you send them back to them, the next purchase gets a discount and then it gets repurposed back into their supply chain. The other thing is they started looking at the greenhouse gases that their factories were creating, and they started planting trees around them to keep the emissions lower, right? And more comfortable for workers. And so there's this evolution around social entrepreneurship, but it's you have to do both, right? So you have to have a business side of things and you've got the social side of things, and the closer you're paired together, maybe some fewer headaches you'll have. But also that's not to say that some of these more disconnected models can't be successful. And it can be tricky because, just getting back to your sort of official business forms, is there's no legal status for social entrepreneurship, right? And so it can be a little tricky to figure out, how do I structure myself? What makes sense? And for us at Trico, one of the things we talk to organizations about is, what are you striving to do? What is your mission? What's the why that's driving you, both financial and entrepreneurial? Hopefully those are tied together. And then determining what structure makes the most sense for you. And then understanding that it can evolve over time. So it's yes, you need to be a business, and yes, you need to be good at business aspects. But in par with that and in line with that, you've also got this social mission that you are committed to and it's driving the work that you do. Does that work? It was a lot. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I get it. And I read Trico Foundation has a very good PDF on your box on your website about this. So I read it. Yeah. I'm just saying that, okay, if there's no business, if there's no paying customer with a clear market need, then there's no social enterprise. Then I just have a nonprofit who's relying on government grants. Yeah.
Yeah. And so it depends, like there's so many different definitions of social entrepreneurship. We keep it really high level and we say, you're using markets. There is a selling of a product or service. That's the entrepreneurship piece, right? And so for us, that's a really core aspect of the work that you're doing in this space is product or service that's being sold to customers. But the way that you're doing that can look very different for the organization. The way that you're having social impact can look very different, and it can evolve over time and change over time, like we saw with Tentree.
Yeah, okay. So is it clear that you said there's no official business form for a social enterprise, like say tax purposes or anything? So say a sole proprietorship can be a social enterprise?
Yeah,
Okay.
so yeah, there's no like designated piece. What, like I said, we talk to organizations about is figuring out, so we say form follows function. So figure out what that function is. What do we socially want to do? What do we entrepreneurially want to do? And then determining what is the vehicle that allows us to do that the best way that we can, right? So whether it is as a for-profit business, as a co-op, as a charitable organization, as a not-for-profit without charitable status, right? So the big thing is kind of figuring out the goals. That the way that we work with organizations is figuring out kind of where we're headed and then determining what makes sense for us legally that will allow us to achieve those goals.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks, Brittany. Any of our other panelists want to chime in and add to Brittany's comments?
Yes, just to complicate things further for you, Olivia, there's tons of people in this space who will say that if your government is your key customer, that's a social enterprise. So it can vary. There's, again, lots of people who think government funding you and being the only one that funds you can technically be a social enterprise. So you got to be careful who you're talking to and how they particularly define social enterprise.
The only thing I'll add is, whenever when I think about when I started my social enterprise back in like 2018, I had to make some real key decisions, right? And it was definitely bootstrapping, kept my full-time job and all the above. But I think one of the things that a mentor kind of said is, are you strong on the social or are you strong on the enterprising? Right? So do you have the skills on the enterprising of the business skills to really solve that problem for customers? Or are you strong on the impact side where you were very clear around the type of impact that you're trying to foster in community and telling that story? And I think that was really important for me to understand of like, where did I lean a little bit more to? And then where were the gaps that I needed to fill and how was I going to fill that either through developing those new skills or getting somebody on my team or having more advisors and coaches to kind of support me. I think it's also kind of moving towards that, really identifying those signals in the marketplace of like what's working, how are you solving those problems for the folks that you're trying to solve it for, and then really amplifying more of the work that you're doing. And really building off of those folks that are purchasing from you, that are your customers, because they're gonna also know new customers for you as well, and really leaning into that in a certain type of way and following some of that traction. But yeah, I just kind of go back to some of those earlier days of really understanding if it's the social side versus the enterprising piece, and then following the areas of traction that I might be cultivating, and really getting in front of more eyeballs and more people, more community, so that I can really try to validate the business model and pivot and prototype a little bit more and change things, because what I started out doing versus what I ended up doing is a little bit different. But at the same time, the social impact was at the core. Hopefully that's a little bit helpful on the bootstrapping piece.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Exactly. That's what I was curious about. Thank you, Jerome.
Thanks, Jerome. Brian, did you have anything to add? Or sorry, go ahead, Jerome. Finish up.
One more thing. One of the biggest things I think is really key. If you're fostering significant social impact, people need to hear your story. And you're probably going to potentially get a customer that you might not be even thinking about through that. So I think of conferences that's aligned with the story and the impact that you're trying to foster is really important. I think of also the groups and the organizations that you want to be connected to as well. But really writing blogs on the type of things, the impact that you're trying to change. You get followers and you get people that's interested and aligned with what you're doing, and that cultivates potential opportunities for business. And I think that's something that sometimes can be overlooked.
Okay, thanks. Brian, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'll try to be quick. On my other hat, I have an e-bike company that a partner started and myself started, locally designed, great for Canada. And we're in the business of selling e-bikes, essentially. So that's the business. But we, and especially my business partner, have this really strong vision for trying to change the way that people move in our cities, reduce carbon footprint of getting from A to B. Like, we just see this city where everyone's on an e-bike, riding everywhere, and our footprint, the carbon footprint, is getting reduced and reduced and reduced. So like, are we a social business? We're a for-profit company. I would consider us a social business, but again, and I'm sure Dan and Brittany have these conversations all the time, like how exactly is it defined? How is it technically or not? And I'm not sure. It kind of depends on who you talk to, I think, from what I've learned. But how we bootstrapped is a little bit of, again, because grant funding is pretty tricky to access if you're a for-profit company, we had to put some of our own investment in. So both partners, we put money in to start it up. And then we did get a futurepreneur loan as well. And they have a very generous definition of youth that goes up to the age of 39, which was kind of helpful at the time. Hopefully that just keeps moving up in the coming years. But anyways, that's how we did it. And that was our bootstrap, and that got us our prototype. And thankfully the prototype worked. And then we kind of went from there. So, but yeah, it's definitely like, it's complicated, like how exactly social business is defined. But hopefully that helps just in terms of like a bit of a bootstrap scenario.
Definitely. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Brian.
I can, just to build on Brian's point, because it was a really fantastic one. That's why at Trico, we think that hey, social enterprise, is it or isn't it, is a less interesting conversation than how can we use business models to maximize their ability to serve social needs. So to me, for Brian's example, the really compelling conversation is not, is he a social enterprise or isn't he, but how can we help him make the most of that business model to serve lowering the carbon footprint vision that he has, right? Like, that is the exciting conversation. If we can nudge the bigger social enterprise conversations to more the, hey, how far could we go with this idea in serving social needs, as opposed to, is it, isn't it, would be just such a more compelling and powerful conversation.
Thanks, Dan. And thanks, Livia, for the question, and to our panelists for their delightful responses. I did get messaged a question from Hannah, who's in the room. She said it would be great to hear from the panelists on what industry, topics, target demographic they are seeing social enterprises thriving in Calgary or in the Alberta market. And Hannah, I don't know if you want to clarify on that at all, if you're looking at a specific area, if you just want to see the thoughts of our panelists broadly.
Yeah, I'm not looking in any area specifically. I just want to hear people's thoughts on what they're seeing. Yeah, that'll be great.
I feel like I'm always going first, so I apologize. It's a really interesting space. So I've been working in the space since 2012. And you do see like ebbs and flows of certain models, right? So buy one, give one was really big when Tom's was coming out. And then there was, we donate a certain portion of our proceeds. And then there's the big debate, is this social enterprise? Is this not social enterprise? For us at Trico, different ways to have impact, and it can evolve over time. One of the things that I would say I was seeing pre-COVID was offering kind of training to corporate Calgary was one of the big ones, right? Or to the city and stuff like that. So saying like, hey, we know how to kind of educate and train around this issue that we're doing within our organization, and now we're going to sell it to corporate Calgary because this is what they need. And that even spaces has had a really interesting evolution, one around just with COVID and less dollars in a lot of these organizations for that type of work. But the other one is seeing more pushback from corporate Calgary of wanting kind of a one size fits all program, right? So we don't want to go to all these different organizations. We want to have one organization that can do everything around diversity, right? And so it's been an interesting kind of piece. At Trico, we're always looking for how creative you can get in this space. And so talking to organizations and starting to think about maybe these trends and these traditional models are the easy to grab and the easy to understand, but maybe not as creative and cool as this space can be. So that's just, I just was using training as like an example of one of the ones that we were seeing and how it kind of has evolved over even just the last 5 years. But yeah, seeing a lot of organizations, and like I said, with the social and entrepreneurial being connected, is there's going to be pressure points and there's going to be pieces to consider no matter what model you decide to move forward with.
Thanks, Brittany. Any other panelists want to chime in with what they're seeing? Brian, do you have any thoughts?
I was just typing in the chat. I don't have too much value to add just because it's everything everywhere. There's just so much happening across industries. It's this explosion of new ways of doing business everywhere all the time. So I imagine there's way more tech related social enterprise launching these days, right? At Innovate Calgary, I'm sure like there's all kinds of interesting stuff going on, as opposed to just what started out as like, how do we create a business where we're hiring people from a marginalized group and then building a business model off of that, which is where a lot of the beginnings were, but it's so much bigger and beyond that now. So that's the extent of my thinking.
Thanks, Brian. It's a good point. I've noticed that too, like that whole hiring a marginalized population and catering and janitorial, like there was a whole group around that for quite a while. But it is a lot broader than that. Jerome or Dan, did you guys have anything to add?
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah, a lot of the ones that I'm seeing it's really pivoting in the tech component and fostering significant impact around that. So there is that product platform component and that then collects data in a certain way or has a certain algorithm that people are trying to leverage to tell a different type of story or a more informed story. And so stuff, obviously some in the mental health space, some stuff in kind of the biotech space as well, environment and as well, solving. There's a few pieces that we've been looking at in our portfolio of companies. Food security, what they realized was they started out just looking at utilizing solving food security in Calgary, but then they built out a tech platform because that's where a lot of the value is, that they can actually move to other communities, to other cities, the US market, Europe market, etc. Because that's and it can be scaled and foster a similar type of impact. So different things like that. So yeah, I think definitely there's a trend moving into utilizing technology or tech-enabled platforms that map and kind of measure impact in a certain way that can then be leveraged to other companies and businesses too.
Thanks, Jerome. Dan, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I completely agree with the rich variety in social enterprise that's occurring in Alberta, which is just so exciting to see. But one definite trend I'm seeing is more and more social enterprises experimenting with sliding scale or pay what you can kind of models, which is also interesting to see.
Thanks, Dan. Any closing thoughts, Hannah? Oh, she said no, thanks, Sarah. Awesome, thanks, panelists. And we had a question from Lynn up in the chat. A key strength of social enterprise is delivering on mission objectives. How might we better measure how might we better measure to value the often not taken into consideration impacts and outcomes as key selling points to draw greater investment interest? Lynn, I don't know if you want to expand on that at all, and we can open it up to our panelists as well.
Hi, I guess my point is more around the system change. Things such as grants, for example, as being the mainstream of looking for funding. This might be great for research, but I think in the enterprise side of the world that, we should be more looking to bid for projects as opposed to asking for funding for a project. And in that sense, it's more a procurement exercise where, like every other business, whether it's government or not, government being the largest procurement in the country, if you're going to build a bridge, you put in a bid for the bridge. And if you're successful, then you get paid as you deliver on the what you promised to do in the building of the bridge. So I think ipso facto we could do the same thing for a lot of the social initiatives in life, whereby we propose what the value is and what we're projecting, and we would be paid for delivering on those values or on the metrics that are achieved. There's lots of work that's been done on this. It's nothing new, but I just get frustrated that tweaking the existing systems doesn't seem to create great change. And so I looked that we need some sort of systemic shift to sort of get a new ball game going here, if you will. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Lynn. Jerome or Brian, you guys want to take a first stab? You guys are usually our late answers. I'll give you a chance to jump in.
Maybe it doesn't, response isn't really necessary. It's more posing a situation that, the social side of life is so important and so many things aren't valued that we hold so precious and dear. What's wrong with this picture? If it was the other way around, where you put a dollar value on things, I think people would look differently on it. How do you value your own health? Very highly. And is this part of GDP? No. So anyway, I won't get off into one of my rants, but I appreciate the opportunity to just pose the question, and enjoy very much the forum that you've got going here today. Thanks. And I'm not even from Alberta, BC and Vancouver, but so I even more appreciate the opportunity to sit in and listen what's going on. Find it fascinating.
Thanks, Lynn. Any of our panelists want to add comment or commentary to Lynn's question?
I would maybe just say this great questions, Lynn. I'm just kind of like reflecting on what you shared, and like for our e-bike company, for example, we applied, just full transparency, we applied for a UC grant here in Calgary to try to build up our company and our scale and our scope. Had a really great process with them, but we weren't accepted into that stream, and had a great chat about why. And part of the why was that we couldn't articulate our impact very precisely. It's a bit vague exactly how we are creating impact. And that was kind of a good challenge for us to keep leaning into that. And we haven't really figured out a great way to do it yet. But it's just so easy because every year we have to fill out our audited, or we have to get our financial statements. We have to prove exactly how we did financially. And it's so easy to let the social impact, okay, we'll figure that out later. We'll map that out a bit more concisely at a future time. There's no like initial pressure to have to clearly define that. So I'm sitting with the same kind of questions, and I see that Steve here in the chat talked about the SROI, and have been involved in a few SROI studies from a nonprofit standpoint, where you are assigning monetary value to certain societal outcomes, and often don't have that monetary value. And when we've had to, as a nonprofit, make a case to government that we are worth investing in, those SROI studies have played a pretty important role. So yeah, I think Steve's onto something with that resource suggestion.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'm a daily rider as well, and also I could relate to the bike part of it. I'm envious of people who have the electric ones, but yes, I guess my focus now, looking towards a resolve on this, is for Web3, where we can value things that aren't currently valued. So whatever, hopefully this will help, boost up the return on investments that are so significant in the work we do. Thanks, Ryan.
No, definitely.
Jerome, go ahead.
Yeah, the one thing I would add, and you're right, Brian and their UC, we do expect folks to be. We don't necessarily tell folks of like how you are measuring things, or this is the way to do it, but we really want it to be very clear around, because you're the expert, and you're saying that you're identifying that you're making an impact, a positive impact, and changing things in this specific area. And so there is an emphasis on that founder or that innovator to be able to clearly articulate how they're fostering that impact. So for me, I always think back of the companies that have a clear impact thesis, right? 1 to 2 statements around a clear impact thesis. They possibly have a theory of change, and then they have real indicators that they're measuring consistently over time, and then they're able to articulate a story that's connected to that. And so that's what we kind of teach in our social impact bootcamp. And so I think when we look at applications, or we look at different companies that are coming to us for investment, the ones that are able to just have those systems already there, that model already there, and then be able to really clearly articulate that, are the ones that are further away. Their applications are just further away. It's the ones that are, it's not fully clear around how their actual business is fostering that impact, even though they might be stating that this is the impact that they're doing it. So I'll just add that in, having a really clear impact thesis, a theory of change, key measurement indicators that you're tracking over time, and that you're seeing the results of it, is a really good place to start and kind of tell that story.
Thanks, Jerome. Dan or Brittany, anything from Trico on Lynn's comments?
I just wanted to draw Lynn's attention, if you haven't heard of them, is John Fullerton of the Capital Institute. He says capitalism as practiced has this idea that the planet is here to serve the economy, which is here to serve finance. He wants to turn that on its head and say that finance is here to serve the economy, which is here to serve people and planet. And I think that ties into the broader theme that you're talking about. And it also ties into the theme that I mentioned before of this conversation should be less about, are you a social enterprise or not, but how we can use business models to serve the planet. And it ties in perfectly to what John is suggesting. And also, I've read tons on capitalism and the history of capitalism. There is nothing in the basic elements of capitalism that suggests that what John Fullerton is saying is inconsistent with capitalism. And what we're finding at Trico is if you explore these ideas, you can also get this idea of capitalism moving from being extractive to regenerative. and from capitalism moving from being self-centered, like me, to other-centered, and how we're all connected. So again, if we can nurture those conversations, and I think we're on the cusp of actually starting to have those conversations, it could actually be the systems change you're talking about, where we value things beyond GDP and actually quality of life. So check out John Fullerton of the Capital Institute if you weren't aware of him, because I think he's talking very much the elements, Lynn, that you're hinting at for the type of change you want.
Thanks very much. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Dan. I almost thought we were going to get through an AMAASE without a book or author recommendation from Dan. So I'm grateful that he came through. If you can pop that name in the chat, I know sometimes when we hear them, it's hard to translate them and to find them. I think that would be greatly appreciated. Thanks, Dan. Thank you, Lynn, and the rest of the panelists for your contributions. With that, we are 8 minutes to the hour, so I will begin the process of wrapping up. Thank you, everyone, for your attendance. I always want to remind everyone that we're all learners here, and talking about these things makes us all stronger, the panelists included. I think, I know when I was panelist, I really was grateful for the opportunity to reflect on some of these questions and challenge my own thoughts. So please resist the urge to think your question is dumb or boring or in any way not worth being asked. And if you didn't get a chance to ask your question today, please come back next month or the next month that you are available to and ask it then, and register. The next AMAASE will be October 11th. Omar has put the link in the chat, as well as the link to all the recorded sessions. So tell your friends, share, please bring your questions. With that, we'll do a quick closing round to just give our panelists an opportunity to share any updates they may have from their organizations or events coming up, as well as any closing thoughts that they may want to reflect on. And then if audience members want to throw anything in the chat, they're welcome to do so as well. Jerome, do you want to get us started?
Yeah, we have our breakfast club the first Monday of every month for social entrepreneurs. And so it's a place to kind of see social entrepreneurs, identify what they're doing and what they're working on. And then we also profile social entrepreneurs as well. So if you're interested potentially in being profiled and kind of sharing to an audience of usually 30 plus people, definitely reach out as well. And then we have a few different pitch events that are coming up that I'll put in the chat also. Thank you.
Thanks, Jerome. Dan?
Been cranking out, excuse me, a number of blogs lately about the potential of social entrepreneurship that we've been talking about. So Ida, if you're out there, if you could throw in the link of the blog that we did for Pioneers Post, that would be appreciated. And that would be it for me. Thanks.
Thanks. And I do see some other Trico resources in the chat. Brittany, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, so Ida put all these lovely resources in the chat for me, which is fantastic. So at Trico, one of our programs is Assess, which is, and do not write this down, the Alberta Social Entrepreneurship Support System. But what we do is we work with organizations. So we actually have most of our content online for free 24/7 for organizations that are maybe looking to look a bit more about what social entrepreneurship can be, what's the potential in the space, and then even diving a bit deeper into what it looks like for their organization, right? And some of those pieces that to consider as they're working in this space. And so we, like I said, we have videos online, we have worksheets online available for free at any time. We also do coaching with organizations that go through the tools. And the last thing is we do funding for charitable organizations. As Dan explained earlier, we are a charitable foundation, so we grant to charitable organizations that are looking to do a test, experiment, learn around their social entrepreneurship. So we have grants available to charitable organizations that are saying, hey, this is what we've identified as our next step, but we want to move it forward in an experiment, in a test, keeping in that affordable loss zone and the safe zone. So we have those available as well. So everything is in that lovely list that Ida has sent in the chat. And feel free to reach out to learn more.
Thanks so much, Brittany. And Brian, did you have anything you wanted to share?
Yeah, I can keep with the link train going here. I'll put them in the chat. One is the Be Local network, just to give a plug there. So it's a network of social ventures in Calgary. The tagline is where doing good is good for business. And so it's a chance. We have learning events every quarter, networking events every quarter. If you're looking for community and you're a social venture founder or you work at a social venture, it's a great network for you to connect with. And the next event is October 10th. So you're welcome to check that out. And then also through that Be Local network, there's an offering. It starts next week on Tuesday. So you'd have to be like, I'm in, and I'm in right away. What's called Design Your Impact. And it's a chance, it's over 4 weeks. You take one class per week and you just get to think about and define what you want your social impact to look like as an operational business. So yeah, a couple opportunities there and I'll throw them in the chat. Thanks a lot for the opportunity to be on the panel.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian. And a couple quick updates at ABC. We do have the Social Enterprise World Forum Community Hubs coming back this year. So that's October, I think, 11th and 12th. And we will be hosting events in Calgary and Edmonton. So if you aren't able to go to Amsterdam to attend Social Enterprise World Forum in person, we strongly encourage you to consider signing up for one of the community hubs where we'll watch the sessions together and then bring it back to a conversation in the local context with the participants there. So that's the website's there as well. I mentioned before, NMATA.ca, if you're ever looking for resources, or if you know a resource that is not listed and want to get it added to NMATA, there's a spot there you can suggest a resource. And we also have our LinkedIn group for social entrepreneurs, where we could just share things that we at ABC or NMATA come across that are specifically for social entrepreneurs, that we post them there. So a great place to stay connected. With that, I thank you all very much, as always, for your participation, and welcome you to join us again next month with your questions. And with that, I will give you 2 minutes of time, and thank you all for joining us today.